the paranormal to the extraordinary, from the weird to the wonderful. This is On the Odd.
If you give me your heart, I promise not to sin. If you give me your heart, if I gave you my soul to have so full hope, and the sun will shine even when the stars come out, and the others won't know what the hell we're all about. But I know you, and I love you. This is true. This is true. It's warranted that I would chase my steps.
In the 1940s and 1950s, reports of flying saucers became an American cultural phenomena. Sightings of strange objects in the sky became the raw materials for Hollywood to present visions of potential threats. Are these alleged visitors from other worlds peaceful and benevolent, or would they attack and destroy humanity? The destructive power of the atomic bomb called into question the progressive potential of technology. Fear of the possibilities for destruction in the Cold War era proved fertile ground for terrestrial anxieties to manifest visions of flying saucers and visitors from other worlds who might be hidden among us in plain sight. If UFOs were visiting our world, where were these extraterrestrials? Could they be hidden among us? Our guest this evening has interviewed hundreds of abductees, heard their descriptions from the inside of crafts, liquids that they were told to drink, even pools of other liquids that they were told to physically breathe in. Please welcome Preston Dennett to the show. You're the author of 22 books and over 100 articles on UFOs and the paranormal. There's just so much. I mean, you can go on and on about this. Your research has been presented by the LA Daily News, Dallas Morning News, LA Times, and I know that your name, if you just Google it, is just, it's definitely you. Like, you own the first few pages of your name, unlike a lot of people, like even me, who I don't have a total common name, but there's other people out there with the same name. And I only get a few mentions on the first page. But yeah, I'd like to welcome Preston Dennett to the show. How are you today, Preston?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it and the glowing introduction. Yeah,
so I have a bunch of questions. I've watched over the years. I've watched a lot of your speaking engagements on YouTube. One of the things that I really love about your talks and when you do speak is you're completely thorough. And you're very calm when you are giving these lectures. Somehow, I feel as though that's really lacking in the UFO community. There's a certain level of anxiousness with a lot of people. They feel as though they need to get it all out, and you put it out in a very concise, calm, and I think that adds a bit of legitimacy to the entire case.
Hey,
yeah.
That's nice to hear.
It's what I enjoy.
I appreciate that. No, really.
I appreciate you doing that. In 1986, what was the turning point, I guess? Like, what happened in your life where you thought, all right, I really need to go to the library, I guess, or look up these really not so easy to find books, in 1986.
Right.
On the subject. That's kind of when I started reading about it, but I didn't get really serious about it for at least another 10 years after that.
Yeah, looking back, I think I probably should have gotten involved in the subject quite a bit earlier because my family was having sightings and encounters and not talking about it. My brother had seen a UFO back in the 70s. My sister-in-law saw a UFO of her Van Nuys Air Force Reserve Base, had a face-to-face encounter with gray-type ETs while in college. So yeah, I mean, it's within my family. My other sister-in-law, a couple of nephews. This would happen later on, but
so you feel as though you have a connection. Your family, rather, has a bit of a
yeah.
The aliens have a focus of your family, is what you're kind of saying.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Certainly not very extensive. No one in my family is like being regularly abducted, as far as I know.
Right.
But yeah, 1986 rolls around. I'm skeptical. I don't believe in this stuff. It's not treated seriously pretty much anywhere that I can see. Not in school, not on TV. There's, no one was really talking about it in any.
It's World Weekly News type of stuff, at
Exactly.
that period.
I mean, that's how I thought about it. I was wrong.
Yeah.
Because it came on the news and they didn't treat it seriously. There was this report about a sighting over Alaska, 1986, November. I remember it very well. They just kind of joked about it. I later found out it was an amazing case with radar returns and multiple witnesses, and it tracked this commercial Japanese airliner for about an hour, and they're trying to avoid it. It's still following them. But none of that was on the news. They just laughed about it and moved on. And I thought, gosh, my brother saw a UFO. I remember that. And this pilot is out of his mind. I can't believe he did this. And it interested me enough to ask my brother. And he said, oh, yeah, I can't believe you wanted to hear it now, because he came running in years ago and we all just like, shut up.
Right.
And
because we're talking, he saw it in the 70s and you're talking about this is 86 now.
Right. He may have seen it in 79, 80.
Still,
not sure of the exact date.
Years later.
Years, right. And he's describing this metallic object with colored lights, silent, hovering, darting around. And I'm like, wow. And he's like, oh, yeah, my friend Greg was there and Phil was there too. And I'm like, Greg and Phil, they were his friends. So I'm like, let me talk to them.
Right.
And because I knew Mark wasn't lying. I knew my brother Mark well enough to know that he wasn't lying. So I talked to them and I'm like, wow. And I started asking everybody. And I found out, my sister-in-law had this amazing sighting. I knew she wasn't lying. I brought it up at work, and the lady I'd worked with for years, she's like, oh, yeah, my whole family saw it. This object, it was hovering, and then it started darting around at right angles. And in walks Dorothy, right? Love Dorothy. I've worked with her for years. She's like, UFOs? Oh, when I was a kid, she says, we were at the library in Koreatown. The library closes at 9 o'clock. They left exactly at 9 so they could smoke a cigarette before the mom picked them up. And suddenly this star-like object in the sky comes zooming down, drops out of the sky, and is hovering across the street, she says, right over the telephone wires. And I'm like, really? And she's like, yeah, I'm telling you, it was round. It had colored lights on it. They were rotating. It looked like two pie pans put together, metallic. And they're screaming when the mom drives up. They're like, look, Mom, look. And she freaks out. They pile in the car and they rush home, right? So they live 5 minutes from the library. They do this trip regularly. This disc follows them home over their car all the way home. They rush upstairs. They see the disc kind of swerve back and forth, and it darts up into the sky. And Carol looks at the clock and she says, oh my God, it's 10:15. How did it get late so fast?
Holy cow, so they had missing time as well. Wow.
Right. And they knew, Dorothy's telling this, has no idea what missing time means.
Right.
Bud Hopkins' book had really just come out. It wasn't a bestseller yet. Missing Time, his book.
Was he the first person to kind of bring that to the masses, the concept of it?
I think so. Him, Jim, Coral, Lorenzen. They also put a book out called Abducted, and were actually the first, I believe. But Bud Hopkins really popularized it. Yeah, he's the true pioneer of this whole UFO abduction movement.
Right.
But so it hit home for me. I tell you, I mean, that was
it was like an awakening, really. I mean, it was kind of like, well, none of these people have anything to gain from making up these stories. I'm going to assume the person you work with isn't BFFs with your family. Like, you know, so it's kind of like her story is really kind of sounding very similar. And
right.
They don't even know each other, probably. You know, it's like at best an acquaintance. Yeah, I mean, that is really remarkable. Definitely, it seems as though something was put in your path to give you that awakening. So that you would do the research and you'd end up. I mean, what I'm going to assume is that you started doing a ton of research and you thought, I need to publish something, because the stuff you were finding out had to have been just eye-opening.
Yeah, it was freaking me out, I tell you. You know, I started asking everyone. It just kind of became an obsession. I'm like, well, this can't be real. I know it is, because these people aren't lying. I'm going to go to the library. I'm going to prove this isn't real. And I found a bunch of books, and they were all pretty much saying, oh, this is real. This is real, all right, and here's the evidence.
Wow.
And, you know, not a lot of books, by the way, but there were some.
Yeah, I used to, in the 90s, I used to work in a kind of new age gift shop. And we had access to tons of these books that, you know, clearly you can't just go to the library and find, you know, books, you know, and videos that are about all of this, you know, at the time, a real alternative type of press.
Right.
And you remember what it was like. It was, you know, you were lucky if you could find a book that took this even a little bit seriously. And all of a sudden, I'm finding catalogs of books that take it real seriously. I believe the company was called New Leaf, and I think they expanded, and they're huge now, or were huge. And yeah, that's when I started kind of seeing, you know, I remember looking at the cover of the, I'm sure you know this book, The Face on Mars, you know.
Right.
It's like that red book. I still have it around here somewhere. And it's like this amazing concept with all of this research. And, you know, it's just very eye-opening. And
yeah, my sister, I mean, she's like, oh yeah, I believe in UFOs. I'm like, what? How? She's like, well, we had a book in our house. Don't you remember? Childcraft encyclopedias. There was a page on UFOs. I don't remember that. Wow. I don't remember that at all. But she's always believed in it because of that. I don't know. There's just not a lot of information early in the day. Now there is.
Now, this kind of sparked something within you where you began interviewing several people. Is that correct? Like,
yeah.
You were basically, I'm wondering, were these people attracted to you for, you know, it's like they're coming to you to get some answers for the, you know, missing time. All of a sudden, you know, people are kind of wondering, all right, well, maybe those 8 hours, maybe that means something. And you sit down with you, and all of a sudden things are starting to click. You know,
yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go on.
Yeah. Now these days, I'm a local clearinghouse. Let me tell you,
no.
Whether you know people have gotten to know what I do, but early on, that's true. A lot of people are very happy to find someone to talk to, and because they weren't being believed and no one was interested. But initially, no, I asked everybody. I was very aggressive. Mm-hmm. At the time, I remember early on, my dad was in the television industry and movies, and he was doing a series called Starman, which was based on the movie Starman.
It was a TV show, Starman?
Yeah. It ran for maybe 10 episodes.
Okay.
But they had a consultant working on the show called Duncan Wilmore, Lieutenant Colonel.
Interesting.
And my dad's like,
that's interesting.
My dad's like, yeah. I'm like, he says, my dad's like, well, you should interview him. I'm like, okay. And mind you, I'm a pretty young man at this time, you know, early 20s.
Uh-huh.
And no real interview skills. You know, I learned this all by doing it. And called this guy up, Duncan Wilmore, and I recorded, of course. I knew enough to record it. And he told me that he worked next to Project Blue Book, knew the Blue Book guys, and said some really interesting information, and was starting to get really intriguing when all of a sudden he kind of starts towing the party line, saying, oh, anyone who believes in UFOs are snake oil salesmen, and there's nothing to it. There's no evidence. And I'm like, wow. And we argued for a little bit. He wasn't going to budge. And at this point, I already knew enough to know that there was something to it.
As soon as somebody says there's nothing to it, that's where I kind of think there's something to it. There's always something to something, you know. You know, there's if it's a concept, you know, it's an idea that's gone further, and it, you know, people just kind of come to the table with so much. Let's debunk everything about everything, and then you get, you know, little things that are you just can't debunk. It's like all of us, and that's where I guess personal stories and experiences really kind of get put in front of you. It's because you know what you know, and you, like, for instance, your family and your friend. These are stories that they didn't just kind of come up with. These are genuine experiences, and all of these other people I'm sure you were meeting. Did you know what Project? I almost said Bluebeam Project. The Blue Book was. Were you familiar with that when he brought it up?
I knew what it was because I'd gotten books on the subject at this point.
Okay.
And was really starting to get into it. And yeah, I mean, you have to really sort of be objective when you start to look into this, because I noticed a lot of people were interpreting their experiences in different ways. I'd occasionally run across people who thought, you know, it was angelic, or one lady's like, I think I saw demons. And I'm like, really? And she's describing this encounter. She says, well, it had a small, thin body and a really large head. And I'm like, well, what you're describing is what other people are seeing, and it's an ET, I think.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I really had to just step back and say, okay, I've got a lot of misconceptions. I thought UFOs weren't real because the stars were too far away, period.
So when people are bringing up the different types of, like that woman said it was a demon, or, I mean, I guess as human beings, we always have to put a label on something. And I think when we don't understand something, it's an immediate that we think it's an evil force. Were these like what type of ETs were these? Like the Greys, were they,
yeah.
Was that across the board what you were hearing?
Initially, yes. And still to this day, it's mostly Greys or some variation of it. But by no means, no, it's not just Greys. Mm-hmm. I get a very wide variety of reports. They do match up to a large degree, almost exclusively humanoid, with 2 eyes, nose, mouth, even to the point where robotic creatures have a humanoid appearance, which, I find that kind of interesting. Made me skeptical because I knew that aliens looked humanoid before I got involved in this field. Sure. And I thought, well, it's too Star Trek. I mean, these people are making it up. But you start to interview them and you're like, oh my God, they're not making it up. What's going on here? And initially, in the beginning, I wasn't happy about what was going on. It looked horrible. I thought like these people being abducted against their will, being tortured, experiments. This is bad. But, I've kind of flip-flopped a little bit back and forth and come to be, even more objective and let the experiencers speak for themselves. And by and large, no, it's not horrible, horrifying torture. It really isn't. Yes, it can be very scary, being examined by ETs and, largely against your will in a lot of cases. But for the most part, they say, no, they're not evil. The ETs are not intentionally trying to hurt anybody. That's not their goal. That's not their agenda at all.
Have you ever brought this up to somebody, like after having a conversation with them, and said, well, what your experience sounds like is possibly an abduction by ETs? And have you ever had kind of a negative response from that person? Because I would imagine that might trigger some people into thinking, well, that means I'm crazy, and I'm not crazy. I could really see that.
Well, one guy I was talking to, he had a very close encounter. And that's something I've learned is that when you see a UFO within 50 feet, 100 feet, 200, even 300, I mean, if it's close and you feel like sees you and it's watching you, that's probably more than a sighting. And so I'm talking to this guy about, what happened, his sighting. He saw this very unusual looking triangular shaped object with blue and white hovering silent. And it became clear to me it was very close to him, to the point where it's interested in him. And he had mentioned having a childhood sighting, which is another marker, a red flag that I look for if is someone being taken. So I'm like, well, what time was it? We started talking about the time. And he had a real confusion about it. And I'm like, oh, God, here we go. And he's had a missing time and he doesn't know it. And so I'm talking around it. I'm kind of circling around the subject until he realizes what I'm doing. Because I don't want to just blurt out and say, hey, you've been taken.
Right.
And so I sort of let him, I walked him to the conclusion, by showing him what he was telling me. And he got, oh my God. He's like, oh my God. And he started to freak out. He had a very emotional reaction. And I've had this happen a number of times where people, go through a lot of emotion when they realize,
I can imagine a lot of people might just recoil and say, I'm never talking about this again, because they're petrified of it.
Yeah, I mean, one lady I called, I was referred to. I had a friend who says, oh, you've got to talk to my friend. She was taken, I think. She had these amazing sighting. Called her up, and the friend's like, well, how did you know about that? Who are you? I didn't tell her that. And no, I won't talk about it, and you better not tell anybody. Click. I'm like, holy cow.
You don't need to hear more than that to realize more than likely that was, she has some serious stuff to talk about.
Yeah, but I learned then and there, don't refer me a witness unless they know
exactly.
that I'm going to call them.
Right.
Wow.
It's not Amway.
Right.
So, can you give me a few examples of experiences maybe that you've seen across the board, which might not be a common, I guess, trait, but once you kind of bring it up, I'm trying to think of how I'm putting it. Like, for instance, you mentioned how there's a red flag for when there's a child who feels as though that they've had a form of an experience and they really don't very often deal with it until they're older. Are there any other red flags, I guess, that you've seen with people who've been abducted or have had sightings or experiences with ETs or just sightings in general?
Yeah, certainly. It's a lifelong experience for people. One guy I interviewed, he says, well, when I was a kid, we had these weird crop circles would appear in our field.
Holy cow.
And I'm like, wow. This is up in Washington. And they lived on a farm. And one time his room filled up with light. And he's like, that was weird. But these little things. And one time he was in high school and he broke his leg in playing football. Goes to the doctor and they're x-raying him and they're like, well, you broke your leg before, you broke your ankle. And he's like, well, no. And they're like, well, there's something in there's an object. And he's like, well, what are you talking about? And they're like, well, you sure you didn't break your ankle? He's like, no, I didn't. And this I've had in a number of cases where people go to the doctor and are like, well, you have something in your sinuses. Or one just recently, teenager goes to the dentist and the dentist freaks out because there's a large BB-like object underneath one of his back molars.
Holy cow.
Large. Yeah, it's larger than a BB. He's looking at the tooth. There's no entry wound. He's like, did you get shot in the mouth? Which is a ludicrous explanation because, well, no, he didn't.
Right.
And there's no entry wound. And it's under the tooth. And so they, called me up. I've got the x-rays. And this thing actually moved around. There's some x-rays. They went back. It wasn't there. They went back again. It was. And I took it to an oral surgeon, the x-rays, and to a dentist. And they're both diagnosed it as a metallic foreign body.
Holy cow. I mean, implants, I'm assuming that's what you're talking about here. Implants were something that I heard and spoke to a lot of people about in the mid to late 90s. It seemed to be I knew one particular person here in New York, and he actually went to the hospital a few times because there was something in his arm. And he was getting really freaked out about it. He was a yoga instructor. He was very in tune with his body, and he just felt this foreign object. And if you touched his arm, you felt like this something. It was like almost like a tenth of a piece of toothpick or something. But there was no, like you were saying, entry wound or anything like that. X-rays, all this kind of stuff, and they're just saying it's a little piece of metal, just leave it alone. But he ended up having it removed, and they quote unquote lost it. It just vanished because he wanted it. He wanted to look at it, and he wanted to know what it was. But they just claimed that it was disposed of, and that was that.
Oh man, yeah,
right.
My brother has that.
Really?
My brother Mark, by the way, who's
great name,
UFO. He's like, one day his wife's like just holding his arm and touching it, and she's like, "Hey, what's that?" And there's this it's about a half-inch long, maybe,
wow,
and it's very slender, like this little stick in his arm.
And he still has it in there?
I'll have to ask him, but last I saw, we don't know what it is. I eventually, begged him. He's pretty, he totally believes in UFOs, obviously.
Right.
But it's not that gung-ho about it.
When there's a physical thing in your arm, right? And it's, it's a little bit different. It just is, you can't really debate that it's there or not. It's there.
I took him to the doctor. Because I knew a doctor. I'm like, not to a doctor's office. I just brought the doctor to him, basically, at a MUFON meeting. And I'm like, look at tell me what this is, doctor. And he's like, wow. The doctor's like immediately impressed because you can actually press this thing and you can pull it up through the skin, kind of.
That's what it was like. Yeah.
And the doctor's like, well, it's a foreign body. I can tell you that.
But it really pissed him off when he was like, well, where is it? And they're like, oh, we disposed of it. It's gone. It's,
yeah, that happens.
Are you kidding me?
All the time. Happens all the time.
Now, I also remember back in this time, this is the early days of the internet I'm also talking about. Because I think when I first got the internet, it was really to look up information about the paranormal for me and UFOs. That was my focus. I was really deeply involved with Montauk Project, and I actually lived with, I rented part of a house, and the other part of the house was rented out by somebody who helped with all of the books and everything, and he just mysteriously died one day. Like, a lot of very, very interesting stuff was going on around me. And so when I first got on the internet in the mid-90s, I remember seeing a photograph that I can't seem to locate anymore, but it was somebody had an implant removed, and they had these great photographs of it, and how they were saying that it was responsive. This person didn't know what it was, and this stuff just vanished. Like, I to this day, every once in a while I'll go on like kind of a wild goose hunt and just try to find it, but I just, there's too much stuff out there now. It's too much noise.
The implant evidence is great stuff with Roger Lear, who just passed away, in his book. Amazing. It's smoking gun evidence, and is going to be, I think, on the forefront of research until this, actually all does spill out. Because we do have the proof. I mean, our government has the crashed saucers and the bodies. I think there's no doubt about that when you just look at the huge amount of whistleblower testimony out there.
Now, do you feel as though with implants, do you feel as though, do you think the government has kind of reversed the technology and they're using it as well? Because I feel as though there's two different entities using that, and that's probably just our government for right now, and this, alien, I guess, agenda. I don't even know what to even call the ETs, really, but...
Right. I'm a big believer we're dealing with aliens. I think that's what they are. I know there's various theories of time travelers and interdimensional beings and a phenomena that tracks cultures, but I think the best evidence is extraterrestrial. It fits in with who we are, we're biological beings on a planet. I have to believe there's other biological beings on other planets.
Yeah, I mean, it makes the most sense to you and me and as individuals, and probably when you speak to people on a one-to-one level, or even a small room of people, it makes sense. But it seems as though as a mass, people just in general don't want to buy into that.
Yeah, well, it's changing, certainly.
No, I
Back
agree, yes.
in the 1980s, people were much more skeptical than they are now. You know, you go on TV or the radio, and they'd bring someone up next to you to bash your research and just cut you down and
Yeah,
attack your character.
it was like a
Debunkers.
1950s thing back then. Like, it's like you're being attacked by these, government officials. And I feel like when they do that now, because the news still will, say, well, little green men have landed in Arizona. And when they do it, I feel like it's a throwback to that same type of let's bash on everything. And I feel as though people are kind of fed up with that type of stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, how about you just talk about it like a normal person?
Yes. When I go on TV sometimes, which is, pretty rare, but it does happen over the years, they cast me in a purple light and I'd be at an angle and there'd be little squirrely things going around, making me look like this is all bizarre and weird, which I get it, but nowadays it's treated much more like news. It's being taken seriously. I think we're at a real turning point here. People allow me to use their names for the most part when I write about their experiences. Mm-hmm. And the debunkers are still there, but it's not nearly as bad.
Yeah, there's a novelty to it that I think people, for the most part, buy into. And usually those people kind of stray away if they don't do further research. But when you really start reading about it, and I know you know this, there's damning evidence. Like, you start seeing, it's just, there are too many people involved, there's too much evidence. Now, of course, people will always say, well, how come every single time there's, and this leads up to a question I have for you, because whenever I hear this answer, I always go to this. There's really not amazing photo evidence. And not photo evidence, but video evidence. And whenever there's so many fakers out there who post, these CGI things that are just very blatant. A friend of mine he's a skeptic, and he'll say, well, look, it's obviously fake, even if it looks real. So I always ask, well, even if it's real, you wouldn't believe it because it wouldn't look real to you because you're not buying into it. So I guess my question is, what physical evidence do you think would convince the general public that these are, that there are sightings, that the ETs do exist? Because I don't believe that TV or the internet is going to convince anyone. There's, again, too much noise. It's too easy to fake. And the stuff that doesn't look faked is such kind of low quality that you kind of question why, in a world of iPhones, how come everything is so blurry and grainy?
Right.
So I'm just not sure, with that. I don't know what would convince the general public.
There's only one thing, the evidence is out there. I mean, there are landing trace cases, multiple eyewitness testimonies, excellent photographic and video evidence, animal evidence, electromagnetic evidence, healing cases, injury cases. Mm-hmm. There's an enormous amount of evidence. Just recently, there's been a disclosure movement on TV headed by Tom DeLonge in part.
Yeah, I've been following his whole, UFO career. Not the biggest fan of the music, but he's doing cool stuff for UFOs.
Yeah. And they showed this video and they gave this testimony by this pilot. Still not enough. I asked everyone I knew, did you hear about this? UFOs are real. Do you believe it? No, they heard nothing.
But that was the biggest thing to probably happen.
Oh, yeah.
Or the most public, rather.
The only thing that's going to convince the public, flat out, I've thought about this, is the aliens, bodies, and the ship. Show it to us. Put it.
Hold on, you just cut out a little.
You know,
I'm sorry, you cut out for about 10 seconds there.
Yeah, the alien artifact, we might be seeing something like that, a piece of alien metal. That'll be, raise some eyebrows, certainly, but it's not going to convince people. We need to see the body. That's what we need. Or the ship, preferably both.
Yeah, I mean, if we were to put it in a museum, or the remnants of it in a museum, I'm sure these, metals or material have certain properties that are very odd to our planet, and show that as evidence, that would convince people right away.
Yeah, and anything short of that, I just don't see it. I mean, you can show any video you want and say this was taken from an Air Force jet. Mm-hmm. People are going to be like, well, interesting. If we piled on enough of it, perhaps. But the evidence is already out there in the public arena, and there are still skeptics who are. It's a very difficult subject for skeptics to approach, to even examine the evidence. It's a core belief, and it changes the way you feel about everything.
There's one thing that happened, with this election that we had in 2016. It was, I use the word noise a lot when things get chaotic, having to do with things. And I kind of walked away from the election a bit because it got too noisy. One of the things, though, that Hillary Clinton said, and it goes back to Bill Clinton, is she had a focus, and it was only for about a week she talked about this, where she was going to find out the deal about UFOs. Do you remember this at all? It wasn't like a big talking point for her.
Right. No, I think it was largely through John Podesta, who was associated with...
Maybe it was through... But I remember she was quoted as... I never heard her say it.
Yeah, she was seen carrying a UFO book. They photographed her.
And I mean... I'm not a big fan of either of these people who are running our country, but who tried to run our country. But I really like the fact that her mind is that open, and that she's thinking, all right, well, you know what? I have a list, and guess what's, one of the things that's on the list is to talk about this clearly covered up situation, whether or not there's evidence, which I'm sure there is, she's going to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, every president, has to deal with the subject. I imagine some of them have gone in utterly shocked to find out. But, Eisenhower wasn't shocked. He had a face-to-face meeting, apparently.
He was probably the only one who wasn't. He was probably more shocked doing a face-to-face. I've heard of that. I've heard that too.
But they've all had to deal with it in some capacity. I mean, one of the Bushes was the head of the CIA, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He has to know about this.
He's still around, too, and I feel as though his name is still attached to so much of this paperwork, and I personally feel, I don't know if you remember just about a year ago when the JFK papers were released, they said that some of the information needed to be covered up, I forgot the word, redacted, because... some of the people are still alive, and I think it's him. And I know that he had to have had, that was a period of UFOs being discussed, and there seemed to be a certain popularity during the Kennedy administration.
Yeah, the subject is not going to go away. I'll tell you, I know that. The ETs are not going away.
We have Tom DeLonge taking, you can buy shares in his organization.
Right.
I'm not really sure what their next step is, but it's really kind of interesting that we have a rock star with a disposable income who's financing a serious team of investigators and scientists. And I'm again, not the biggest fan of the music, but I really respect what he's done for the community.
Yeah, we've had movement. Finally, it's been a traffic jam on the side of the government forever. They're not budging. They're not saying a word about UFOs. And it's really, I'm excited to see what's going on here. And I do know that there's concern within the UFO community that this agenda is very tightly controlled and that we're being led down not a pathway of full truth and full disclosure, but a partial disclosure and manipulated truth. So there's concerns about that. And I agree. I have to say, seeing that video of a UFO by this Air Force officer was all well and great, but right behind the curtain there, they have the actual UFO. So
Right.
why are you showing me this grainy picture? I've seen better, by the way, much better video and still photographs. So I'm a little frustrated, but I'm glad because this is what's going to happen. I mean, we're going to trend towards open disclosure. It's going to happen eventually.
Yeah, we need a real transparent administration. That's what we really need.
And once that happens, I'm guessing we're going to get an escalation of activity and perhaps even open official contact, a real honest-to-God meeting that's public between ETs
that's
and leaders.
I think that, that might be the coming thing. I mean, with the world in the state that we are in, that might be the thing that we need to come together as humans.
Wouldn't that be amazing
if
that happened?
Genuinely. It genuinely would. And
the ET agenda, I mean, I think we've got a pretty good handle on it personally. I've interviewed enough people who've been taken on board to know what they're after. And they're very concerned about all things human. They're very interested in our bodies, certainly, in our genetics and our genetic material, and creating what appears to be a hybrid race. I'm speaking mostly about the Greys in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of, what are people being told? What's the message? Over and over again, it's pretty much the same thing. There's three main areas, and the main message the ETs give, and it doesn't matter if it's, Greys or human-looking ETs or praying mantis or what have you, it's the same message, which is you are destroying your planet. Over and over again, they're saying you're messing around with nuclear power. What's this with the pollution? You're destroying your ozone layer.
Mm-hmm.
Why are you doing this? There are better ways, and this is what it's all about.
I'm a large believer of interdimensional existences, of whether it be ETs or timelines, or I just have this a very large belief of where we are is it's a physical space, but I just feel as though, just like a cartoon cell, there's several layers. Right. And that's kind of the way that I always think about the spectrum of time and of just existence. So do you feel as though the ETs have control to go through these different dimensions? And is it possible this is how they're manipulating time? Or maybe manipulating our perception of time, but for them it might be just a matter of going through different dimensions.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. I'm a huge believer in other dimensions. I've had out-of-body experiences myself, a bunch of them. Mm-hmm. Got really into it. I've interviewed people who've had near-death experiences and all that, and I believe the ETs have a very good understanding of the other side and the other dimensions, and that's evidenced by people are taken on board their craft and taken back into time. There are just weird stuff. I mean, there's one guy I would talk to. He was watching a UFO with his entire family when suddenly time froze. They weren't moving, and neither were the birds in the sky. Nobody was, except this one guy that I interviewed. And this UFO landed. Gray-type ETs came out and abducted him. They stopped time, basically, is what it looked like to him.
Wow.
And another guy, he had a friend who was a contactee, and his friend comes up to him and starts describing his house in detail as it was 10, 15 years earlier. The only way he could have possibly known is if he was telling the truth and the ETs took him back in time travel to his house in the past. And didn't believe his friend and says, "Oh, this is true. I want to meet your little green friends." Well, this is a Navy medic that I was talking to. He's actually one of the chapters in my book. And the Navy medic was taken on board by these ETs and shown himself how they can manipulate time.
Wow.
So yeah, it does happen. And they've got a very good understanding of it, way beyond ours.
And it really does seem to be something that started with the, I believe it's the fight over LA, or the
Right.
Battle of LA or Battle of Los Angeles. That seems to have triggered, I think that was also 3 months after Pearl Harbor had happened, the attack on Pearl Harbor. And prior to that, although there is a spotty amount of, discussion here and there, I feel as though the battle over Los Angeles was the kind of the beginning of this movement. You can pick up the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, and I'm sure you're well aware of this. It seems as though that's a UFO sighting right in there. It's one of those things I always bring up to people, and it's like, oh, there's the Bible's boring. It's like, hey, you want to see a UFO sighting? It's like, now read the book literally. Have a lot of fun.
Yeah, I just looked at a bunch of Renaissance paintings, and from the Middle Ages, dating back to the 1100s, 1200s, 13, 14, 15. There's all these paintings with UFOs in them.
Get out of here, really?
Oh yeah, it's all over the internet. You can look it up pretty easily. There's all kinds of evidence of ancient aliens. There's hieroglyphics. There's little stone statues from, the pre-Columbia and places like this.
But
Peru.
It seems like in North America, anyway, that was the beginning. That was like the maybe it just captured the imagination of people, but for the most part, that was a real covered up situation.
It was the first time I think we started to look like, this could be ETs, because there was, the airship wave of the 1890s, which started in California and swept across the U.S. and the world partially. There was Foo Fighters in World War II. There was Swedish ghost rockets back in the early 40s. So there's little bits and pieces, but it wasn't until this giant, Battle of Los Angeles, which was 5 or 7 people died of falling debris and heart attacks. Thousands of people saw this. It was photographed. There was more than one object. They tried to shoot it down with 1,500 rounds of ammunition.
It's nuts. Like, they did everything in their power as though it was just like Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, and apparently did take one of these things down. There's documents now out, and researchers who are saying, yes, we shot down a UFO in that incident. So
makes sense about the cover-up then.
Right, it sure does. They did cover it up. They tried to call it a balloon. There was a photograph, so they couldn't. Huge incident. There's documents that prove that it did happen.
10,000 people experienced it.
Yeah, I talked to witnesses myself, and they're like, oh, gosh, some of these were much lower than, you've read about. One guy was describing how one of these things came right up over his house, a couple of 100 feet up.
Wow.
And it wasn't Japanese airplanes. Came out from over the ocean and went back out over the ocean. And, right where there's a whole bunch of activity, where I think actually there's an undersea base.
That was my next question about the, I have one more question real quick about the LA sightings. Do you know if that was reported on the East Coast for the most part? Because I did a very quick search, and it's almost as though it existed on the West Coast. That was it. Like, there was no reporting. It's like, I'm just not sure. It wasn't really a popular story when it was a massive undertaking.
I don't know. I know it got into the LA Times on the cover, I believe.
Mm-hmm. It's just back then, it's almost, a New Yorker probably never even saw an LA Times back then.
Right.
So yeah, you know what? I'm going to do the research after this and see if I can dig it up. I love going through old newspapers and finding this and that. So with USOs, which are unidentified submersed or submersible objects,
right.
There's not really too much information on these, because the first thing I think most people are going to think about are submarines. And the ocean is another kind of uncharted place on our planet that we have no real idea, no real concept of what's down there. Or rather, the general public doesn't. When did USOs start coming into form? Like, when were they mentioned, and what kind of information, can you share about them? Are they all around the world? I guess if you can give an overview of USOs.
Yeah, well, I sure can, because I've become like the go-to guy with this, because off the coast here of Southern California, it's super active. It's one of the most active places on the planet, and I wrote a book about that. It's my latest book. But USOs, there's not a lot of information about them, and weren't looked into for years and years and years, really at all. Probably the earliest references you can find, I mean, there's historical stuff. Mm-hmm. Columbus, apparently. Christopher Columbus, his group there, the Nina and the Pinta, and, those boats that he took out here to... they had an encounter. They had a really dramatic encounter with a USO, I believe, coming out of the water. Big, bright object. They all saw it and recorded it in their diary and had no idea what it was.
Wow.
So we know it goes back years and years. And Charles Fort, he's the pioneer of paranormal research. First guy, really, to look into anything unusual and say, this is going on. Wrote a series of books. The first was The Book of the Damned. Mm-hmm. And just talked about, ghosts and rocks falling from the sky and UFOs and some USOs as well. Then it was Ivan T. Sanderson who wrote Invisible Residents, and he had a chapter on underwater objects. But that was it. For years and years, finally, Carl Feint, he put up a website and wrote a book, Water and UFOs, I believe it's called, or something like that.
Okay.
And he's kind of the world expert on this subject. But yeah, it's a worldwide phenomena. I started researching it here in Southern California right when I started, back in 1986, I was getting accounts. Didn't realize it at the time, but off the coast here, we have got something going on. In my latest book, I've documented about 150 cases of objects over the water or going in and out of the water there, some involving hundreds of objects.
Really?
And so I'm thinking, gosh, it started really scratching my head. It stretches back all the way to the 1940s, continues to the present day. I started building up these data points about why I think there might be an undersea base. But I was contacted from people all over the world. One guy in Hot Springs, Arkansas, had an encounter at Lake Hamilton, a tiny little lake, not big, he says. He and his 4 teenage friends had this UFO, this USO, rise up under their boat and trap it. They could not get away.
It kind of like beached it, it's like when you hit a sandbar or something.
Yeah, I mean, they were out there in the lake, and this thing comes up, hits their boat, and they can't move. And they're gunning it. They're trying to get away, and suddenly they have missing time. It's hours later. They're elsewhere on the lake, and all freaking out. They were obviously abducted by a USO. They target boaters. It's the strangest thing. This guy I interviewed off the coast of Florida, on the edge of the Bermuda Triangle, kind of, not quite in it, in the Bahamas, that area, saw these beams of light under his boat. He and his wife, and they're just freaking out because they were huge beams of light. And this object zooms straight for their boat, goes right under it. And this happens in a number of cases that I've documented and interviewed people, and stays there for a little bit. Nothing happened to their boat. Lucky for them. Often, people will just have their electrical system fail and their compass is spinning and so on. But nothing happened. They weren't scared. They just saw this thing. It targeted their boat, and then it moved on. And I'm like, well, could it have been a sub? He says, no. I've had subs surface next to my boat. I'm a huge sailor. I've been doing it my entire life. I've seen subs. This was not a sub. It was huge. It was round. It was very bright, and it had these giant beams of light coming out of it.
Wow.
So, yeah, all over the world.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, where else can you really get so much space to kind of do maybe whatever they need to do? I mean, they can go possibly as deep as they need to go, and there's usually probably miles upon miles of no one around.
Right. Oh, well, listen to this. I mean, here's probably one of my favorite encounters in terms of USOs that I had the opportunity to investigate. Involved this guy named Ray Sachs, an electrician's mate on the USS Clamagore, which carried nuclear missiles back in the day. This was in 1971. He's traveling up the East Coast. On the surface of the water, he's on lookout. And the captain's up there, the second in command, another lookout. And they're just traveling along at 12 knots or so when this USO comes zooming up. He says at around maybe 100 knots, 80 knots, which is, freeway speed, very fast.
Sure, yeah.
And starts pacing the Clamagore right alongside them, totally silent, freaking everyone out. The sonar guys are getting nothing, and they don't know what it is. And one by one, all the officers, the upper officers, the higher level ones, exit and come on deck so they can look at this thing for just a few seconds at least. They go back below deck, and finally this thing just zooms off. And the second in command turns to the captain and says, "Captain, how do I report this incident?" And the captain turns to him and says, "Officers who report incidents like this do not move up in rank."
Holy cow.
So it wasn't recorded officially. I'm sure the commander had to tell his, superiors at some point what happened, because that's his job.
Now, do you think they dismiss a lot of this stuff as military testing or experimental crafts? I have to imagine that there has to be a percentage of some of these where that has to lay, that falls into place. I'm not saying that it's not the majority. I mean, it's not the majority, but there has to be, some level of this where it can be explained as military crafts.
Right. Well, in that incident on the Clamagore, obviously it's not, because it had them utterly baffled.
Right. Yeah.
And they are military. So that's one of the reasons I think that we know it's not. I looked into that here on the activity off Southern California, because it's heavily militarized, this area. It's got Point Mugu Naval Base. There's San Clemente Naval Weapons Station, or Seal Beach, rather. San Clemente is a Navy base, basically. And that's right near Catalina Island, which is where all this activity is. And I found a bunch of reasons why I know it's not military, the vast majority of it. And probably the main one is people are taken on board these craft, and they see aliens. It's not military. They're seeing grays. They're seeing praying mantis. They're seeing non-human beings.
Now, do you think that the UFOs and the USOs are one and the same? Or do you feel as though these are different species?
No, I'm sure they're the same. They're the same thing. I just don't see. I think the problem is you can't really call a UFO when it's underwater. It's not flying.
No.
And so that term was coined.
It's also an amazing way to hide. It's like, hey, we don't want to be seen. Or even to get out of possibly, the sun or anything like that. You go deep enough, there's no sun penetration. And
no people, no observers. So they can be down there in large numbers, which I believe they are, because they've come out, and people have seen hundreds of craft. There's got to be a parking lot down there, or if there's not a base, because it's a perfect place.
I mean, if they can handle the pressure, they have hundreds of thousands of miles.
Yeah, they can come in and out of the water like nobody's business. There are cases, Mark, where these objects are traveling under the water at, not a couple hundred miles an hour, thousands, zipping around like they do in the sky.
I have to imagine that would create some pretty interesting. I guess if you're deep enough, you're really not affecting the top.
Well, they've got some way of, they must have a force field.
It's a whole different technology, Wow, the USO thing is really fascinating. It really it's a really mind-blowing thing. We're near the Atlantic Ocean. I've never heard of anyone, claiming to have seen one here, but I'm sure.
Yeah, that's why I think there might be an undersea base here, because it's not like that in the Gulf of Mexico, or anywhere along the East Coast, or even Northern California or Oregon or Washington. but right here off the Southern California coast, it is rocking. I mean, oh my God, it's just nonstop. Every year, there's a really well-documented USO sighting.
Yeah, that's really amazing. So you've spoken to people who have been on board these crafts.
Oh yeah.
Is it across the board? I guess identifying the inside and I mean, I've seen drawings where it seems very sterile, very much like an operating room. You don't really hear much about outside of the areas where people are being, I guess, operated on or implanted with things. Is the whole craft so like that, like sterile, or are there different sections of the craft? And is the craft as big as the craft, or when you go in there, it's like a different dimension where it's much larger? Like I mean, it's
yes. That's so interesting you mentioned that.
I know I'm throwing a lot of different weird questions at you, but
no, I mean that's not well known that UFOs can actually expand in size, and it is bigger on the inside than it. One guy went into a UFO. It's maybe 20 feet across on the outside. On the inside, it was vast, and that's not uncommon.
If they can manipulate time, they can manipulate matter, and if you can manipulate matter, you can make it bigger and larger. So.
Exactly right. And I think that's exactly how they're doing it, because they've got to control this. But when someone's taken into a UFO, it's usually to the examination room. And you can almost look upon UFOs as floating hospitals, because there's a very strong medical theme that runs through a lot of accounts. And this is what most people are seeing, is the examination room. But there are multiple rooms that we know about. If I were to like build an amalgam of different people's accounts, I think we've got a very clear picture of what the inside of a UFO looks like. There's the examination room. There's corridors. Most rooms are sterile, very clean. The lighting is indirect. The metal itself glows. They're not always described as being super clean. Sometimes people do smell like sort of not a foul odor, but not a pleasant odor.
I never heard of that. Wow.
The air itself is described as sometimes hard to breathe, thinner perhaps, or different somehow, but breathable. The gravity is usually the same, so I find that interesting. People aren't necessarily floating around, though that does happen. They walk around or are carried from place to place, or they're lying on a table. After an examination, people are sometimes taken to another room. They may be put in a chair, like a dentist chair with a helmet that comes over them, and given messages of various types. There's other rooms which have maps and screens and what looks very much like Star Trek technology. A Star Trek set. I've heard that a dozen times, with little oven dials and amber lights and red lights and green lights. There's another room that people are taken to, the engine room. This is also not uncommon, not super common, but happens regularly. And usually it involves this sort of device in the center of the room that is all sparky, like lightning, perhaps, or a round silver ball type thing, or something that's covered up but seems to exude energy. Pillars are often described. So there's sort of this, and they're told how it works. And by and large, it's almost always something to do with electromagnetics and magnetics and this sort of thing.
Do you feel as though they're trying to share their technologies with us?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm writing about this in my next book, Not From Here, which is actually a series of books. So that's going to be volume 3, a chapter on exactly that.
And will this be book 23?
Yeah, I think it will be.
That's pretty amazing. I mean, just taking the commitment to publish that many books, I think everybody appreciates the information that you bring to the table.
Hey, I'm obsessed with this. I'm not going to let it go. Good. Blame my brother and my sister-in-law and that pilot Kenju Chiroshi for going public.
where do you find people who have these experiences? I mean, these days, I guess they could hear a lecture and reach out to you in a similar way that I reached out to you. But do you have like a much like a better way of reaching out to people who want to maybe remain anonymous but share their experiences? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do have a website. If you just Google my name, it'll take you there, and you can contact me through my website. And I get a number of people that way. In the beginning, it was just word of mouth. I had enough friends, family, and coworkers to build a network, and this experience is a lot more common than people realize. I think almost everyone knows somebody who's had an abduction experience. I heard J. Allen Hynek, the father of modern ufology, who worked with Blue Book, say he was quoted as saying that 1 in 40 people have had an abduction. And I thought, whoa, that's a lot. That's too many. There's no way. And so that's kind of what prompted me to start really looking into this hardcore. And I didn't have to interview 40 people within my circle of family, friends, and coworkers before I found 5 people who, had a face-to-face encounter or were taken on board, had a missing time. So it's a lot more common. It's not hard to find people. Initially, it was just my family, friends, and coworkers. That was the subject of my first book. But, after that, boy, it's just been an unending parade of people coming to me.
Do you think people confuse, I guess, paranormal and spiritual sightings with ETs or vice versa? I don't know what your opinion is of spirits and ghosts and things like that.
Absolutely. Sometimes I looked into all the paranormal. I've written books on ghosts, on Bigfoot, on out-of-body experiences, levitation. I've looked into all the paranormal aspects because it's connected to some degree. I do believe that these are separate phenomena, ghosts and near-death experiences and so on. Demonic stuff. I don't believe the ETs are demonic any more than, I believe they're angelic. I think we're dealing with separate phenomena here, and people, yes, do get them confused. And in some cases, it's not easy to tell the difference. I mean, I've had people call me up, at their wits' end because they're having UFO experiences and ghost experiences at the same time. So it can get very confusing and hard to separate. But from as best as I can tell, we're dealing with largely separate phenomena that are interrelated in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that the largest difference is people come in physical contact with the ETs a lot more often than you hear about people coming into physical contact with spirits of almost any kind. Usually those evil spirits will have physical interactions with inanimate objects, but it's not so often that you hear a spirit attacking a person in a physical way.
Right. I've talked to people, who have had that, who've been bitten and pushed and, touched and so on, possessed even. Do
you have a theory as to why the ETs are here?
Gosh, that's a $1 million question.
Yeah.
They're sure interested in us. There's lots of talk from the ETs themselves to the experiencers that we're going through a transitionary period where our vibration is being raised and we're moving up a dimension and, weird things like this, which don't make a whole lot of, I can't quite grasp it. But I keep hearing it. So that makes me wonder. There does seem to be an intense amount of interest in us. And a lot of talk about what's going to happen to our civilization and that we're at a cusp where we could possibly destroy ourselves. So I think that might be part of it.
It's
because we're messing around with nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and I almost feel as though things like nuclear weapons or lasers or there are so many technologies that, let's say like from the year 1300 to 1800, right? There were no lasers. There was no creation of the recorded medium. Like there was nothing, and you take the past 100 some odd years, And the amount of technology that's been created almost out of thin air almost appears to be, and I'm sure you've heard this anyway, the theory that it's possible that we reverse engineered a lot of this technology from alien technology, which makes a lot of sense. Like, where do we come up with the concept of a CD and a DVD and the whole, just, you know, a lot of these technologies just don't make sense. Like, it's kind of the normal creation, you know, the telephone, for instance, you can kind of see the birth of it. But the laser, like, you know, it doesn't make as much sense.
I know, it's weird. I mean, you could go back 40,000 years and pluck some caveman out and bring him here, and he'd be as intelligent as us, you know, IQ-wise, probably.
Sure.
And there we are, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, you know, beating our chests, trying to build fires, you know, trying to keep warm and survive.
Right.
And suddenly, boom, you know, it is the industrial age, you know, the turn of the century is when it really started to happen, which coincides exactly with the airship wave, coincides very closely with this whole UFO activity coming in a way to society that's unprecedented.
And
yes,
a lot
UFOs, UFOs have been around for hundreds of years. We know this, right? But nothing like today.
No. You know, the manipulation of all of these inventions, you know, having to do with the laser, Wi-Fi, you know, all of the different technologies that are surrounded by the wireless, you know, spectrum are all in the air. You know, it's all a manipulation of wavelengths. And it's just something we just, it just comes from almost one invention. And it's almost as though, you know, it touches upon maybe some of the stuff that Tesla was working on back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. I can't imagine us not getting a push at some point. And if we could find an alternative energy source that's not solar power. I mean, I don't like to give too much of a strong opinion about solar power or wind power that kills birds and makes too much noise and are huge. But it just seems as though we're going down the wrong path when it comes to harnessing the energy of the sun. And I wonder if these ETs can push us in that direction.
Yeah, that seems to be one of their main agendas. There's three main messages they give people. One is warnings, environmental-wise. The second is spirituality, alternative healing, you know, past lives, out-of-body experiences, this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And the third, absolutely, is alternative energy sources. Over and over again, like I was saying earlier, people are shown the engine room and told how it works, and in some cases, told how to actually build free energy motor. And I've talked to people who've gone through this, and some are well educated, some aren't, and are really frustrated because they don't have the education or the money or the resources to build what they know they can. So yeah, I think that what's amounted to is the aliens have contacted our government leaders and been stonewalled and are now doing a grassroots movement. They're going to just go to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. They need to find that next Nikola Tesla who...
which they found him. He said he was in contact with ETs.
Yeah, and I thought, I mean, and you can kind of believe it when you look at his, you know, his work. I mean, you know, even to today's standards, you know, when you say, oh, well, you can light that light bulb without physical contact, you know, all right, it makes sense and we can explain it now, and maybe we have a little bit more of a grasp. But this is a guy who came up with it literally out of thin air. It was a concept he had as a kid. And that is just one of those, you have to give him some level of merit when a mind works like that. He's not going to say he met with aliens or ETs or, actually, didn't he claim to have been born? I forget what his exact statement was, but you have to listen to somebody like that a little bit closer.
Yeah, he's a true pioneer. He's a Da Vinci. He's a
Yeah,
giant, towering character in human history.
that's a good
Wa-
comparison.
Way bigger than, Edison or even Einstein, honestly.
Hmm.
He started it. He's the father of science, really, in a
And it's
lot of ways.
another reason why I kind of dislike the Tesla Motor Company, because you have nothing. They have nothing to do with Nikola Tesla except for the electricity. I mean, and and it's DC powered. That's another thing. But it's I like to see innovation. I'm sure you do too, and hopefully we can get to the bottom of this. I think people like Tom DeLonge are on the right side of the discussion, and thankfully, his music has financed this movement that a path that he's on. I'm sure is not going to be easy.
Yeah, a lot of rock stars and musicians have seen UFOs. It's interesting. What a pattern I've noticed is ETs. Who are they contacting? And a lot of them, the people who are being contacted, are people who are influential in society to some degree. They're teachers, they're writers, they're inventors, they're doctors. They're government people. Yeah, I think he fits the pattern there.
I just wanted to ask at least one more question. So a lot of times people are hypnotized to kind of unbury these feelings. And I just wanted your opinion on that. Whether it's helpful, or do you think you should kind of stay away from it?
Yeah. I think it works. I think there's no doubt that it works. It's been proven in multiple studies. Police studies have proved it. The show Mythbusters actually did an episode where they proved that hypnotic regression works.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was a great episode. I was very happy to see it. And they took their whole cast, put them through a traumatic incident involving an intruder, and then had them write everything down they remembered, and then put them all under hypnosis. And under hypnosis, by God, they remembered just about everything.
Now, did they know that a traumatic incident was about to happen?
No.
Wow.
No. They set it up. It was really nicely done.
There had to have been a line in their contract somewhere when they first got hired, right? Kind of saying, we can do anything. Wow.
Yeah, it was one of my favorite episodes that they've done.
I'm going to dig that up. That sounds really interesting.
But yeah, I'm a huge supporter of hypnosis. I know it works. And I recommend it for people on a limited basis because there's problems with it. It's not a royal road to the truth. What you're going to come up with is a hypnotically recalled memory, which is different from a consciously recalled memory. It's never going to be the same. And it's not the only way to recall things. You can recall things consciously through meditation.
Absolutely.
Which is very similar, really, to hypnosis, but allows you to, maintain a more conscious state of mind. Well, you're still conscious, by the way, when you're under hypnosis. You're still aware. It's just a deep, deep state of relaxation. But it opens up a can of worms for people. I've had people go under hypnosis and suddenly, there's not just that one incident of missing time. It's a lifetime of incidents that they've suppressed, ignored, and have not looked at. And now they're swept into a real, emotional roller coaster.
Have you ever been hypnotized?
Not in a formal way. Certainly, I've had my friends try to hypnotize me, and I could feel it. I could feel my body buzzing and going deeper and deeper. But no, I haven't. Mm-hmm. And I would actually, if I had missing time, I would do it because I'm one of those guys who wants to know.
Now, do you have any missing time that you recall? Anyway?
No, I haven't. I'm skeptical of this. Never saw a UFO. But I have to tell you, Mark, as soon as I started investigating this stuff, I started to see UFOs.
Wow.
And often it would be just far lights way off in the distance. I joined CSETI, a group to call down UFOs, and damned if we didn't do it. We would see these lights that would, sometimes hover or dart around, and often just a little bit anomalous, but kind of ambiguous. You can't quite tell. But there's a few times, one time this came out of the blue. I'm just driving on my way home through Woodland Hills, very densely populated, had been talking about UFOs fiercely with my brother and sister-in-law, and I'm on my way to my condo where I lived at the time, and it was late July 1992 or so. This ball of light comes right up in front of my car. I thought, whoa, it's a bird, but it wasn't. It was a ball of light about the size of a golf ball. Stops right in front of my windshield, 2 feet away, darts back and forth a couple of times, dips down, and then goes straight up through the trees and into outer space, I guess.
Wow.
This thing targeted me, came right for me to check me out. I was probed.
I mean, that's wild. You know, I live near JFK airport, and I'm on Long Island. So not only is every light in the sky, you know, it's like there are new lights every 15 minutes to look at. But you know, there are a lot of sightings here, but I would have to dismiss most of them. Just because of that, just being so close to Manhattan, 2 airports really that are nearby, and there are a couple small airports out on Long Island, you know, way out east. That only one time did I ever see anything that I feel as though was a legitimate sighting, and I saw it with my roommate at the time, and him and I just couldn't believe that the overall speed of a particular light zigzagging in the air, kind of like 20 degrees off the horizon, kind of like the stereotypical, you know, light in the sky. And this is way before drones and way before anything could really zip zap. But I'm fascinated by it. I'm almost afraid that if I were to experience something a little bit closer, I don't know how I would be able to handle it. I guess you just handle it like anything else. You know, you don't have much of a choice.
Right. Well, New York, I mean, I wrote a book called UFOs over New York. It's one of my more popular books.
Actually, somebody bought me your book. I forgot I had this book. It was bought for me as a present years ago. Maybe not that long ago, actually. And I found it just this morning. I started flipping through it. I'm like, I gotta like reread this book. I love New York history and I love New York everything. So sorry.
Yeah,
go
they've
on.
got a lot of encounters in New York. You've got one of the big hot spots, Pine Bush, you know, upstate New York, the Hudson Valley area. Mm-hmm. Hugely active. Not as much so, I understand, as it was in the past. But yeah, all kinds of activity going on in New York.
We're always looking to do day trips, so.
Oh, that's the place.
Yeah.
I mean, it's attracted tourists from all over the world to see UFOs who have seen them and written books about them. You know, there's multiple books written about Pine Bush alone.
Wow. Yeah, I'm just looking. Oh, I'm only 100 miles from there. It's a 2-hour ride.
Hey.
I think that's going to be a day trip for us. Yeah,
bring your camera. Cool. That's all I can say, because people are taking photos too, and some are amazing.
Yeah, that actually, to be honest with you, that seems like it would be kind of a cool trip. You know, it's we just love, you know, exploring in New York in general, but going to a place like that, and I'm looking at neighboring towns, there's a lot to do in that area.
Yeah, every state I've written books on a number of states. Each state seems to have their one huge hot spot. Or a couple, for that matter.
Well, you see, you did Colorado and Arizona, and those are the real kind of big ones. And Nevada. But, you know, Nevada's considered. But did you do one on Nevada? Yes, you did.
I did.
Of course. You're very thorough. I think I'm going to have to invest in your collection. That's what I'm going to have to do. This is definitely something to have next to each other on a shelf to just kind of flip through and grab that. You said Not From Here is you're coming out with a 3rd volume? I
am. Yep. These are books that explore kind of the more unusual and less talked about aspects of onboard encounters mostly. Wow. But yeah, I'm going to put out a volume 4 eventually. I'm not sure about a volume 5, but these are all adapted from articles that I've written over the years and had published in the various UFO magazines, and which, you know, have one issue and then it's off to another issue. And I realized, gosh, a third of my research was just being buried in these articles.
Wow.
So that's what I decided to do, this series of books, and I updated each article and made it a chapter, and I'm having all kinds of fun exploring, what happens when people are, given liquids to drink aboard a UFO, alien drinks.
You're like, what's that? That's
all kinds of weird stuff. People are just all kinds of stuff that happens to people. They're made to go into what's called a pool of water and made to breathe the liquid. The breathing pools, they call it. I did a chapter on that, a chapter on what happens when people shoot at a UFO, shoot their gun, a chapter on people who've had phone calls, of all things, from ETs. And I know how that sounds, but it happened to Betty Andreasen. It happened to Whitley Strieber. It happened to someone I interviewed. It's happened to a lot of, people who are well known within the field.
Do you think that they use like if you're phoning somebody, obviously we've figured a way to transfer data over the line. I mean, is it possible they're communicating through kind of a data, especially if you have an implant in you or something in you from them, maybe that's, could help you decipher the data. That's
right.
wild.
Well, they're all about, they can affect electromagnetic instruments. We know that. They stop cars. They make radios fuzz up, or TVs even, static. Why not talk through the phone? It's part of their pattern. Wow. And they do it. So these are the more unusual types of cases, which you don't hear a lot about.
No, I've never heard of anyone drinking anything from or a breathing bath or a pool. That's wild. That's
some really crazy stuff goes on board UFOs. There's one chapter where it's all about UFOs over graveyards. They target cemeteries and graveyards. I had no idea until I started running across case after case. I'm like, wow. And yep, it's a thing. No doubt. They are not only hovering over graveyards, they're landing. People are seeing humanoids, and some of these graves are being disturbed.
I wonder if they're, they want to learn about our life and our death and what happens to us, the decaying process.
Yeah, I've got various theories. Maybe they're recovering implants. Maybe they're recovering genetic material.
Wow, that's crazy.
I don't know.
Crazy, but
but they hover over mines as well. Gold mines, copper mines, titanium mines, uranium mines. They're landing there. They're sending beams of light. They're taking uranium out of uranium mines. We got a case like that. So it's just insane.
It's like they're learning about all of our obsessions. Maybe it's crazy to them that we even bury our dead. It's just.
Hey, that's another theory I didn't even think of.
It is definitely weird. Like, the whole, the way we have taken religion to our everyday life, and we don't even really kind of view it that we, that we bury our dead forever and leave an undisturbed piece of soil over them for as long as possible. And never ever do anything with the land.
And then we build a house over it, and the house is haunted. I've got cases like that.
Yeah, well, yeah. There's a place like that in Seacliff, New York, where they built an entire office building on top of a graveyard. I don't know how they pulled this off. I think they did it in the early '80s. And there's been nothing but paranormal sighting after paranormal sighting there, and really bad things, to the point where I really want to go over there and check that out.
Yep. Probably not a good idea.
I'm sorry. It's
probably not a good idea to build over a graveyard or an Indian burial, a Native American burial ground. That's what they did here in the Santa Monica Mountains. And there's a group of about a dozen houses that are paying the price for that.
Yeah, I wonder if they see that. That could be a whole other theory as to the aliens. The ETs are possibly trying to figure out what is triggering the spiritual world. It's just a wild, wild story, and hopefully one day we can shed a little bit of 100% truth being brought to us instead of it being covered up by our government. I do feel as though a lot of the physical technologies are covered up. the stories, the photographs, the autopsies. I feel as though it comes to interest for a few years here and there, but then it just gets goofed on and covered up again. But as long as you keep doing your research and putting out books, there's hope. After Volume 3, do you have another project in mind, or are you working on several books at one time?
Yeah, I'm putting out, my first book was called UFO Healings, and a very unusual book which covered about 100 cases of people who've had a physiological improvement as a result of a UFO encounter. Like, for example, this police officer in Damon, Texas, was struck by a beam of light from a UFO, and it cured the wound on his finger. He had a wound from a baby alligator bite.
Right.
And it cured it. It absolutely cured it. It's very well documented. And there's a lot of cases like this.
Now, did they bring him onto the craft after that?
No. He was just struck by a beam of light, kind of random.
Wow.
And, that was 100 cases I wrote back in 1996. I've gotten contacted regularly. Every time I speak about it, someone tells me another case. So I've got 150 new cases, and that's the subject of a new book that I'm putting out next year.
In that instance, if you're healed by the alien, by the ET, I tend to say both, because when I say alien, I feel like there's something negative about it. I don't know. But with the ET, I would almost have this great feeling towards them. I would just... there have to be people out there who have had experiences that they reflect on as a positive experience instead of a questionable or negative experience.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, some of the people I'm interviewing, they're like, oh, they're my friends. I feel closer to them than I do to my family, is what some people are telling me. They love these guys.
Wow.
But not everybody. One lady, she was healed, and they were so arrogant. They looked down on me. They treated me like a lab rat.
Arrogant.
They were just, she's like, oh, my beautiful baby. And, they were showing her son. And they just kind of looked down at her like, oh, you guys are not intelligent. You're just animals to us, is the feeling she got. But she was healed. And she says, no, they're not evil. They were just kind of unfeeling and arrogant.
It's what my dogs think of me, maybe. It's like that I'm arrogant.
Appreciate it. I take the subject.
Yeah, man. That's awesome, awesome discussion. I'd love to have you come on really whenever you want to. It's open door policy around here.
Awesome. Well, yeah. Next time I have another book coming out, I'll give you a shout out and maybe we can get together. Sounds great. Yeah. Thanks very much.
Because life gets boring when I awake from sleep. Pretty places, new faces, people walking down the street. I don't know what it all could mean. Should I try talking to them? Should I be listening? I won't open my eyes. vast reaches of your mind. At any point in time, I'm here with you. And my subconscious breach is unintentional. I don't mean to cause you trouble.